Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I hadn't heard that.
Oh, hello. Wow. You guys are so worldwide travelers.
Yep.
Look at this. That's amazing.
Yeah, we're all over the place.
I like the branded one too, Brian. That's awesome.
Yeah, I got a few of those, but I need a green screen so my head doesn't look like I'm alien.
Yeah,
You know.
that's happening.
So I've ordered one, and we'll see how that works.
That's cool. Claire and I was under the impression you wouldn't be here today. And Nathaniel,
I wasn't planning on it. And then I ended up having some phone calls that conflicted with my other stuff. So then I was out of there. And it was 4 o'clock. I thought, where do I go? I came here.
We're excited that you're so thrilled about being here. My goodness.
I'm excited to come here. Well, it's been 2 weeks since we last met, so let's do a little bit of catch up. Things are holding steady for, me here. Of course, we're still shelter in place. There's, talk that things will be changing in the near future, but I've not really paid too much attention to it. I can tell, the ongoing fatigue and stresses, you can see it in family life. There are certain days where individuals are more tense than others. So it's interesting. You can see the fatigue and the wear of that. We're trying still new things. We're kind of doing social distancing, kind of like coffee hour or even a happy hour type time where we're still socially distant, but just connecting with just a couple of people at a time. And that's been helpful. We've noticed like the difference that makes, just the simple connectivity, a lot of times the laughter that comes from that. So that's been really good. That's on my end of things. Lynn, how about you? Tell us about what life is like at the beach.
The Maui is awesome. I wish I was there. So it's been good, just tracking in place here. We haven't been in lockdown here in Alberta. So when we do go out, like today, I just went and got my oil changed. And I just drove up and sat in the vehicle, and they did the work, and I paid through the window. Through the, just they brought the machine to the car and paid. And so, there's enough. I don't think there's too much shut down here in our town. It's just that when you go to a place, there certainly is physical barriers and distance and signs and all that kind of stuff. So, but still, it's functioning. And other than that, just lots of Zoom calls, just trying to keep up and enjoying working in my backyard, trimming a tree.
Nice. That's good. Claren, what about you? Catch us up. What's life like for you last couple of weeks?
Yep. So just sheltered in place, which is, as I say, is getting bored. I'm getting bored of myself and my surroundings here. I'm immune compromised, so my wife doesn't really want me out anywhere. So I got her kind of guarding me as well. I snuck out. I had to run into town for something, and I snuck into the grocery store to do some shopping when she was at work and didn't know. So I told her today though, and she still loves me.
Good.
Anyways, that felt really good. Having some good connections and some huddles, and I'm pretty proud of my pastors. The shift that they're making.
Good.
This is kind of helping in some regards, getting some disciple making traction.
Good.
We had a conversation this morning with one huddle, trying to think about what does this look like if this goes on a lot longer than we were anticipating. And then as things start to open up, what are the things that we've been experiencing that they hope to keep?
Yep.
And what will be some challenges going forward? And will this be like an elastic band where we made some changes and all of a sudden things open up and it'll snap back? And they're saying that there's a lot of people, just even leadership, really just can't wait till it goes back to the way everything was.
Oh, wow.
And so that's some leadership, that's lay leadership. And so as pastors are trying to, move this along, and they're kind of, and we were talking about it, it's maybe okay that this goes on a little longer, because the longer it goes, the less likely everything will snap back to the way it was.
Yeah.
And so maybe there'll be some healthy changes. And so they see some healthy value shifts that are happening.
Good.
And so they're just hoping that gets embedded, like, and held. So anyway, so that's
good.
In the midst of all the bad, there a lot of optimism.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's good stuff. I don't know that I've been dealing with the lay leader side of it, but it completely makes sense that the point leader might be sensing the change and the adaptation that needs to be made out of it, but the lay leaders are wanting to go back to the norm. I haven't encountered that just in my realm yet, but I could see where that totally would take place.
They want to go back to Egypt, to leeks and the garlics, because leeks and the garlic, I like leeks and garlic.
Yep.
So
I hear you. Nathaniel, catch us up. How are things in your, and what is your background? Is this Holland?
I think it's Brussels, if I remember correctly. Not sure. Anyway, for the past 2 weeks, life is very busy, especially with work. I should say this COVID-19 make us busier than before for all of us. And it's full of challenge, but very interesting, especially as I deal with different properties of our churches and our own. That's for sure. It's very interesting for me. Just one request today, please do not ask me any question. As I just finished a meeting, I'm very blurred right now. I just want to sit in and learn from you all, guys. Thank you.
Great. No questions to Nathaniel. Brian, can you please ask Nathaniel a question?
Yes. So Nathaniel, so for me, my family's doing well. We're on a kind of a new rhythm with meeting on a Zoom call every 2 weeks, which we started. We've actually been doing that probably 3 times already, and it'll come again in another time. So that usually involves games and discussion of how we're doing together. For my huddles, I'm bringing one to a close. Actually, it's going to move into a coaching style support. But actually, this Friday, I'll be meeting for a second strategic planning session with one of my huddles. And then the following Friday, this one that I'm kind of shifting and transitioning will have its final scope and sequence, at least for the time being. And we'll move, I think, to probably a monthly coaching huddle time. So I'm kind of excited about how that looks, because I'm already thinking, so if that's moving, who are some other people that I can invite in? I've obviously wanting to ask these people that I've been discipling to find huddles. They are in their own context, as well as finding other pastors to huddle with. So we're seeing that next generation follow through, which is exciting.
That's great. I find too that as those seasons come and go, like you're describing, that being intentional about keeping a holding pattern, not immediately jumping into a new thing, even if I feel like I've got some good clarity on what that is, just that holding pattern is good, with a little bit extra free time to think, and maybe there's some new insight that comes in that time. That's great. Awesome. Good stuff. All right. Well, we are in our chapters in Speak Out, where we're talking about the arc of history and the crucible of biography. I'm appreciating that we're in this topic, because I've had a lot of times where I've been in conversations where I've thought, man, people need to know this stuff more, because they're, the challenges that they're facing. So I've just been in multiple meetings and webinars where I've thought, gosh, I wish I had the space to be able to just kind of show how these play out, and how it's important to be able to understand your context to communicate contextually well. So I'm excited to push forward in it. Totally hear you, Claren, that It's not always immediately clear, and hopefully maybe even today we'll provide a little bit of additional clarity as we do that. So I think I won't go back in and reteach history and biography. I think we've got that. We understand it well enough, so we won't review that. I think what we'll do is we'll just set aside the whole time to just let, let's try and get at least 2 people to share their history and biography, and let's play around with it in a workshop style to see a little bit more jump out at us, and that may be helpful even if it's not your own. So help me to remember. I think Claren walked us through some history and biography in the past. Has anybody else done that? I don't recollect that happening. Okay. So let's do that. Do I have a brave volunteer that wants to go first for us? Great. Brian's up first. Green screen, Brian, go for it. Oh, Lynn, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Lay back
sorry,
down in your chaise lounge.
I thought I would get in and take a short amount of time and leave a lot of time for Lynn to be able to express his stories and things like that. So,
oh, you know that was a passive aggressive jab right there.
Okay, so you do know me. Yes, you do. So I live in a town called Didsbury, and Didsbury was founded in the late 1800s by Mennonites moving from Markham, Ontario, to come to this area, and actually Didsbury, and so they established a town in Didsbury. Didsbury was established in 1905, just actually when the province of Alberta was established.
Let me pause you real quick. I'm gonna track this and show it here on the tool so that we can do it. I want to make sure that I'm spelling correctly. Didsbury, am I?
Didsbury. So Didsbury.
Okay. Yep, I heard an N in there. And then I'm sorry, I didn't open it up in enough time to be able to get this. Give me some of those specific dates and times.
Yeah, so 1894, a group of Mennonites came out and, homesteaded in this area. And in 1905, it was established. Probably one of the first thing the history books have is the first group building in Didsbury was a church. So these Mennonites settled here. My great grandfather was a part of that. A couple years later, coming in to the establishment of Didsbury. So his name was Willard Archer, or William Archer, and with that, Didsbury was established. It became a kind of a agricultural town. There was a sense that this was going to be kind of the breadbasket, let you say, of Canada. And the CPR railway, so there was a transcontinental railway put in Canada, and it came into Didsbury into 1897, which was a major event. The station was placed there, and certainly that established the town. Town grew, had a couple fires early on in the 1900s, 1914, 1924. I'm just going to really rip quite quickly through here. But another thing was the establishment of a Bible college in Didsbury, which is called Mountain View Bible College, in 1926. And Lynn Dietz and myself actually went to that very college in Didsbury, not in 1926, but
glad you clarified that. That's great.
So I'll probably get to a few other things. The town today is just over 5,000. I'm just going to rip through. There was slow growth in this town. Some of it due to other towns around had a little bit more rapid growth, and so Didsbury was a slow growing town in this area. People who came out, actually families who started, so major folks were the Chaunces, the Sherricks, Stauffer, you don't have to get all these names, but Stauffers, Steckleys, Swams, Traubs. The reason why I say those specific names is because those are families that still today have connection to the Evangelical Missionary Church of Canada. And for Western Canada, Didsbury was a center point, almost like the Jerusalem. The district office was held here in the missionary church. Evangelical Church also had a church here. They were more centered in Medicine Hat. So these families, and even my own family, still have homesteads or farming. So Archer, there's an Archer farm here. I'm not part of that, but that still was a big part of that. I came to Mountain View Bible College in the 1980s. I think Lynn was just finished off in the late 70s. But that was a center point of this town for a while. Now, I'll just say historically, probably places and things like that. This was an agricultural farming community, absolutely, from its startup point. The church was a large part of the community. It still has influence today, lesser so. The majority of Didsbury would not be church goers, even though we're about a town of a little bit more than 5,000. And so that's where we're going to. I'm kind of giving you the historical perspective. The biography, you've noted a few things, but I also talked to a person who's been here for about 40 years. He was the CAO, or the what's that called? County administrative officer. So a significant influential person in the last 40 years in the community of Didsbury. And so in the last 15 years, there's been maybe 1,000 people added to the community. This person saw things like, actually one thing on the date, I think it was, it must have been the 80s, late 80s. But the summer games, the provincial summer games were held in Didsbury. And that actually brought a lot of improvements to buildings in the community, to even the golf course. It was sand greens and things like that. It got, grass greens. So there were significant things. We have a community center with so these are kind of placements. And this guy was telling me about some of the improvements over this period in Didsbury with places, in the last 40 years, I would say. Probably from his perspective, he saw some of the people in his era as people who helped with the building of the community of Didsbury. People who helped with building, community centers like the curling club and things like that, where he named those people. Israelson and Whitlow were two names that he gave. And lots of volunteerism, community banded together. He also noted one of our former pastors. His name is Willard Swam. So I mentioned the Swam name earlier. Willard was a highly community-oriented pastor. And we still today have our lead pastor in Didsbury, Colin Creighton, is highly community-oriented. These pastors help lead, I think, the connection of the church back into the community. Even though there's a lot of people who wouldn't say professing Christians, there's a felt understanding that this is a necessary part of our community. I think finally this person talked about the church. He was heavily involved in church, actually even on the board of the Bible College when it was here. The Bible College has since left, moved to Calgary in the early 90s. And so that Bible College presence moved out of here. By the way, it was a Traub who started the Bible College. My first wife, we were married. She was out of that Traub family. And now my son in Abbotsford, BC, has met a young lady called Sarah Traub. And Sarah actually comes from this family who started in Didsbury. So that's just a little bit of a side story. Now, you might have questions. I thought one of my points that I was trying to get to is some Kairos moments.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you want me to share those, or do you want to interact with what you've written right now?
I think maybe hold on to that
Okay.
and let us play with it, and then
Okay.
I definitely would love to have you do that. So hopefully what you're seeing, especially as they start to get laid out, you know, and again, sorry for misspellings and things like that. I'm trying to kind of collect all those things. So here on the top one, this arc of history, I was trying to keep it relatively chronological as Brian described those things. But one thing that stood out and caught my attention, you know, you've got Mennonites, a spiritual people with very strong values, community-oriented values. The church is built first, and then you see that thread from the Bible College to even the agricultural roots. You know, there's a sense of like we're doing these earthy things as good folk. I kept getting that sense. These are good people. These are, it's not slow in the sense of mentality, but just like we value the slow part of life. You can see the population, even with a Bible college, doesn't spike tremendously. It remains relatively small, but you see the thread of how the church has played a part in it. By the time you hear the biography, which I think is interesting, you've got Brian's grandfather, and Brian, were you saying he was a part of this Mennonite homesteading as well?
Well, of that, I'm not really sure. Obviously they were part of the church the very beginning. So my great-grandfather actually was a homesteader. My grandfather became a pastor. Now, I would say my grandfather's history was a little bit early on in life. He was kind of the town drunk, and he got saved, transitions. But even the Archer family has been part of the church history in Didsbury for sure.
But he became a pastor. He went from drunk.
Yeah, my grandfather did, yes. But my great-grandfather was a farmer and established a homestead in Didsbury.
Okay, so watch here's look at the church context in this community all the way through, and even the town drunk becomes a pastor. Think of the hope that is there in that story. And then the way that Brian's weaves into all of that, you know, I love it that, you know, I don't think these are just side notes too. Look at, why would Brian and Lynn go to that college? Well, because of the rootedness of all of this stuff up at the top. And, you know, of course, Brian's wife comes from this. Why? Because this is the crucible of biography that people from this area go through, related back to this. I thought this was interesting that I think you said COA. I hope I got that right. But there are numerous names of builders, people who have helped to contribute to the society. Why? Because these are people who, with deep roots, they're agricultural folk who think not in what's going to happen next week, but what's going to happen 5 seasons from now. And what will we do with the season? You know, they're long-term thinkers. They build community centers in the same ways that they plant whatever it is that they grow right there, because they know that these long-term investments will make a huge difference. I'll bet you they value kids tremendously here. You're going to see, you know, young people are a heartbeat of this community. Again, you see that church leaders recognized a certain point where the church probably across Canada was losing its influence, and they did some strategic things. They wanted to make sure that the church remained influential, And they, from what I can understand from that testimony, have been successful at that, which is an anomaly. Most people are looking for these change leaders to be able to do that, or a community like this that's so rooted would reject change leaders. I'll bet you if you went back and listened to those stories and read what they said and how they pitched the change, you would find gold for how to pitch change for the current future that you guys are in. Maybe even how to be able to find how to say things in, here's what I think we need to do out of COVID. I think we need to pivot in this way so we don't go backwards, we move forward. And you could then reference the heroes of the community and say, John so-and-so said this back in that day. I think we're in a similar time right now. So just those are some of the things that I'm seeing here. And I'm not going to take the time to draw all the arrows. I was verbally doing that, but you can see all the connection points about how this isn't haphazard and random. This is what happens when people come into this community. And I think the one that resonates the most for me is this. This is what people do when they come into this community. Transformation can happen. Now, of course, there's plenty of stories that transformation doesn't happen, but that's what happens when people's biographies meet the history of this location. How about, let's say, Claren and Nathaniel. Any other thoughts? Lynn, I'm excluding you because you're more familiar with this area. I want a little bit more of an outsider perspective, even though I'm sure they know it too. Are you noticing maybe other connections that I didn't draw out? Claren, don't forget, if you're just going to say something, your mic is on mute.
Yeah. Well, it's just kind of neat how I had no idea that, Brian's history ties so much, like his biography. Yeah, so that was just kind of neat to see that part. I mean, that's not great, but I had no idea about that, Brian. So. But you're not sure then whether your archer was actually somebody else that lived in the community that came to Christ, or whether they actually moved from Ontario as well.
Oh, no, my archer roots definitely moved from Ontario to Didsbury. So there were several waves in just a few years, but there were several waves because the prairies were opened up for farmland, and you had to clear the land. You had to do it was a lot of work. And so that's where that came from. Yeah.
Okay, there you go. So as an American, this is part of the history that I couldn't understand. Prairies opened for farmland. There you go. Now that makes sense to me. The homesteading that began to happen, and because I was thinking, what's the catalyst that is opening this up? There you go. That makes a big difference. And now, those are pioneering leaders. Those are people who are brave, though they're doing traditional things. They saw a vision and stepped boldly into it. So I think it's interesting that though they think with long-term results, they're still pioneering folk. And then I think, in a sense too, Brian, is a part, he's like a blue blood of the community in a sense. He carries a name that carries weight as well. So of course, who is going to be a change agent? Who would God raise up and provide opportunities to be able to be a voice, even for the exact denomination that is rooted and founded here? There's no coincidence here in that. The Father is using both of these things together. And then think about how there's an Acts passage where it talks about David and the people from his generation understood their times. I think that again, another storyline that fits into in that same way. Brian is crafted from the earth of this place, the soil of this place, and carries that DNA, and then a weighty voice that way. Clarence, sorry, I'm waxing poetic. You were going to add something.
No, that it's just amazing how that ties together. I agree. Like it's a beautiful story.
And again, it's not a coincidence. The more that you dig in and see these things, the more that it's not coincidental. Now, I would imagine too, what's the demographics of the population, Brian? It's small, 5,000. Is it primarily white?
Probably the median age is about 43. So it would be a little bit older, but there are 3 schools, active schools, like an elementary, a mid, and a high school in the community. So you do have kids, and that serves the broader region as well, rather than that, you know, so you're talking about a broader region of maybe 50, could be up 10, 15,000 people that services as well.
What about racial mix? Is there much racial variety?
Not a lot. You'd have a number of different languages that are spoken, but certainly English is the major language. So your ethnic mix is mostly in service industries like restaurants and gas stations and the like, that you'll have an ethnic mix. Otherwise, it is quite a white community, as well as you'll see that in the congregation. There'll be maybe, you know, I'd say 2 to 5% of Didsbury is non-Caucasian, you know, mix. So yeah, but there are ethnic people here.
Great. What you'll find then, just like here at this point, the prairies opening for farmland was this, you know, movement of people that way. You'll probably find, if you look at even the individual people groups, maybe it is service industry. I would imagine that it's right here around when the community center and the provincial games happened. Jobs opened up, and therefore what happened is you had this migration of new people moving in of different backgrounds. And you're going to find, though it's going to fit in the bigger arc of history, the beginning of a new history and biography for a new people group. And so, Brian, this might be an insight. It could be that some of the changes that need to be navigated is the, I want to say it redemptively, sometimes in circles that are not as, in communities that are largely still white at this point, there still is a fear factor of the alien, of the foreigner, and there's an internal prejudice. Those could be mindsets and things like that, that an archer with the weight that you carry could speak to, so that your church begins to look less like, you know, Didsbury of 100 years ago and looks like Didsbury now. I think when you start to look at, this is what it means to go from our Jerusalem to Judea and into Samaria too. Samaria is largely coming to cities that we live in. And this is at least my observation in when I went to Calgary, and, you know, and I was up in Saskatoon, and then I was in Edmonton as well, that it's interesting that people retain their ethnic identity and practices to a much greater degree in Canada than they do in the United States, where schools are continued to be encouraged to remain language specific. And so all that just to get at, Samaria has largely come to our towns, and yet have we positioned and postured ourselves like Jesus towards Samaria, or do we keep distance? And so I'm not trying to cast any judgment on it. I get some of the reasons from my questions that I was asking at that time for why and how things like that developed. But I think, what do we do when Samaria comes to our town, and how do we engage in what that looks like for the future here?
It's interesting that you say that. We do have a little EMCC church just outside of Didsbury, about 6 miles, but it's connected to the town as well. And we have an African pastor who's there, and it's been very challenging. It's an all white little church, about 20, 30 people. And guess who is most opposed? It's an archer. I'm serious. His name's
not Brian, is it?
It's not Brian at all. No. So this would be a distant cousin, right? Just from that. But again, you just hit it on the nose about the challenge of that pastor that's expressed it many times is in the depth of the holding on almost to this one cultural identity.
Brian's story really helped me in such a sense because when I first joined EMCC to be credentialed, I need to read the book Common Bond
Yeah.
that we have. I didn't appreciate that book before, but now with Brian's story, I tend to appreciate that book more.
That's
Mhm.
beautiful.
Thank you, Brian.
That's so beautiful. All right, Lynn, any comments that you want to make in here before we turn to some of Brian's Kairos?
Just that I remember, so you see the guy Willard Swallam there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really good friends with his son Murray Swallam, who's a pastor in our denomination.
Mm.
And Murray would tell stories about the EMC district conferences coming up to points of change and transition, and a new decision had to be made. Well, Murray remembers his grandpa, Willard Swallam's dad, standing up in the conference and giving a strong appeal for moving forward.
Mm.
So it was one of those anchor characters in the storyline of the church to stand up and say, folks, I believe God is saying we need to do this.
Yep.
You know, they would have been the homesteaders, and the homesteader stands up and says, we need to change and move forward. And that is the grandfather of a friend of mine.
Mm.
So I remember Murray thinking about the courage of his grandfather
Mm-hmm.
standing up to traditional people that had been second and third generation removed from homesteading and building. And then Murray actually has taken on that kind of spirit himself from time to time in our assemblies.
Right.
When Murray stands up and talks, everybody seems to listen.
There you go.
I don't know, Clarence, do you think? I mean,
Yeah, I agree. Well, he doesn't say much, but when he does, he's listened to, right? He's like kind of a postured guy.
Because that's the way that these Mennonites operate. You know what I mean? For the most part, you know, in broad brushstrokes, that's going to be that Mennonite homesteader. That's, I mean, I know guys in my community that do exactly that. They don't say much. And then when they do, it's powerful and weighty and very wise, and almost everybody's convinced.
Yeah.
That's good.
yep.
So again, you know, I put courage embodied here. You know, he's embodying what he saw from his own relatives, but those are heroes in that community. Those same things and traits can be embodied and are valued in that community. So when you want to communicate change, you'd better say it the way that they do it.
Or have them say it.
Or there you go, have them say it. Yeah, talk to them. They're change makers. I need to talk with them first and make sure that they understand and have the chance to know that what they care about matters in this transition and won't be lost. There's so much preservation in this that is probably a very key value here. We don't want to lose what our great-grandfathers came here to build. Those are deep, deep values that are just in the air you breathe. So when I preach a message, you know, there in Didsbury, I'm going to communicate, you know, I'm going to use an Old Testament passage, and I'm going to speak about the history of the fathers and grandfathers that, you know, that were the builders up to this point, just like here in this community. I'm going to make myself one of them, like I understand who they are. And then I might, you know, hey, by the time I get to that point, I need to communicate change. Just like Murray said, you know, we were in a meeting with him not too long ago, you know, and I might throw out a little bit of a side joke about him if I had a relationship with him. We all know he's like this, and you get that laughter in the room. But listen, when he says it, it's time to make that change. So again, I'm totally, you know, making stuff up as I go along, but those are the levers that you're pulling that are, you're quoting the text, you're pulling in the historical figures, and you're speaking like a native, casting change for the future and
Nice.
choosing that stance appropriately.
Nice.
All right, Brian, what else are you seeing here that we maybe haven't hit on yet?
Yeah, I mean, there's several things that I caught out of this, probably one of my major Kairos points is that I am part of a movement that started over 100 years ago that's still ongoing. There's been some challenges on the way to reformat. And as Lynn said, I mean, there's time and time again, I think the EMCC itself has changed. We're no longer just the Mennonite focus, we're missionary, and then we're evangelical missionary. We have had an ongoing transformation that I think continues, but this movement, I think it has waned somewhat, but it's starting to regrip and recharge and redo. So that's been, you know, a heartfelt thing that I was really caught at. You know, part of a movement that started over 100 years ago, and here I am, you know, still part of it. I think uh, the impact of a few can be far-reaching. Is another Kairos for me, because there were the first people who showed up. There were about 34 people. That included kids and husbands and wives when they first showed up. And I know we can say that that was just a little bit of a start, but from this community, missionaries have been sent out all over the world.
There you go.
And pastors have been raised up.
Yep.
And
That's
all
just
those kind of things. So those are kind of the things that have gripped me a little bit more than I realized was there before I did this kind of activity. It's got me deeper, and some of that seems a little superficial almost, but it's really impacted my perspective of where I've come from, where I'm going, and where, you know, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of things. I got some more, but maybe you want to comment on those things.
That's great. It makes total sense to me. And sometimes we become blind as locals. When we're so familiar with an environment, we don't see things. You responded to these with that unconscious competence. You knew they existed, but sometimes you undervalue them because they're normal. But when you're able to see this in an exercise like that, exactly what you said makes sense. You probably are experiencing a new realm of pride and honor about where you come from and about what this place could do. And that's exactly what the leader or a leader in a community like this needs. You've got to have that good hometown pride and, you know, regional pride to be able to then speak back to the heart of it. You know, I love the way, and notice what we're doing here. I'm beginning to take and craft and hone some of the Kairos moments that Brian is stating into potential memes. You know, these are the things that could transform if they get back into the water, because they're founded in the historical roots of the community. You know, for Brian, at a personal level, you know, the realization, I'm a son of a century-old movement, and, you know, all that means and entails. And then I added in here, though he didn't quite say this, and, you know, I'm adding the scriptural weight underneath it, I am in a position for such a time as this. Of course, that's biblically true. That's the narrative that we find ourselves immersed in. And then this is beautiful. The impact of a few can be far-reaching. Let that be the sermon series that you preach at a church for, you know, a season, and then just do nothing but tell stories about Didsbury and all that had happened, show a parallel in the scriptures, and say, so this is why it's time to raise up new pastors and missionaries. You know, I mean, you'll totally be grabbing your audience right by the heartbeat that they love and resonate with, and you'll be awakening in them this kind of like, yes, of course we will do this. So beautiful
That's really good. Yeah.
All right. You should probably take a screenshot of that, Brian.
I got it.
Perfect. That's really good. So again, I think, you know, I'm going to say this to Clarence specifically, but I think for all of us, going through the process on your own, you may not be able to see it. But going through a workshop style, a lot of times new insights will show up, because I think sometimes you need an outsider's perspective to see it with fresh eyes. So any other thoughts before we turn from here to our next person.
One thing I observed here now is just that I always liked Brian, and now I know why. He's comes out of a Mennonite from Ontario.
Oh,
So I'm a Mennonite from Ontario. So
By the way, just to note, I did not grow up in Didsbury. I grew up in various different points, but my family roots are here, and we decided to move here when I took this role. And so it's kind of cool to be here with that. So
Yeah.
back to your roots.
Yeah.
That was great, Brian.
Great stuff. All right. How about Lynn or Nathaniel? Do you guys want to go for it? And we'll give it a go for 10 minutes.
I could go unless Nathaniel has it anchoring. Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, he doesn't want to be asked questions.
Okay. Well, I live in a community called Three Hills, and I am about 40 miles east of Didsbury. And I remember going into a little tea house in Three Hills when I first moved here, and I saw an old map on the wall of the bathroom, and it was a map of Canada before Canada became a nation. And Three Hills was a landmark on the map in an area of Canada called Assiniboia.
Yeah.
And it was it was not on a waterway, but it was three distinct hills. And back in the day, before trains, people moved about by landmarks. So Three Hills was a landmark. So there's some history of Indian ceremonies in the top of the Three Hills. But then we move forward to 1912 when Three Hills was incorporated as a village. It was down on the little Rosebud Creek, but then it moved up to the top, up on the Prairie Plain in 1912, located to the CNR Railway. And then, of course, the town was named Three Hills after that because of the Three Hills just north of it. So, and then that site became a center for the surrounding area, and it was a strong wheat growing area because, like Didsbury, the prairies were opening up and farmers were coming and homesteading. So that began in 1912. 10 years later, in 1922, a Bible college was founded here called Prairie Bible College. And that helped increase the population of the town. And then from the 20s to the 70s, the town then began a slow expansion, community growth, and it became a place that had a reputation for hospitality, a nice place to visit, a nice place to live. It became the county seat of government and healthcare, that kind of thing. A new hospital was built in the 90s. And then along the way, there was housing for seniors going up. The biggest demographic in the community right now is seniors and young parents with children age 0 to 10.
Makes perfect sense.
Those are the two biggest demographics there. And agriculture is the main economic engine. In 1995, methane gas and oil industry began to pop up around the area. So then that drove in more places that provided hotels, restaurants, those kinds of things. And then in 1995, Rehoboth Christian Ministries came to town. They thought it was a good place to help developmentally disabled adults function in their community. In 1998, it hosted the Alberta Summer Games. And back in 1991, a cruise show, a cruise night, an auto show for card collectors started, and that attracts, sometimes upwards of 3,000 and 4,000 people on the weekend for these. It was one of the largest ones in Western Canada. So those are some of the things that have been going on. It's interesting that the town was chosen for the Summer Games in '98 because of the Maxwell Memorial Tabernacle, which seats 4,200 people. And up to 2005, it was the largest center for gathering in a Christian worship in Canada. And of course, it's been decommissioned since then. But then along the way, there has been upgrades to the community area, like pools and the pool and the curling rink, and the town school got an upgrade in 2001, and community parks got an upgrade in 2014, and walking trails came in 2015. And so then you had what was developing in this area were farmers and ranchers became the first ones here. Then people connected to a Bible college. And then along with that, then there was growing up this place where it was a safe, rural, small town to raise your family.
Yep.
So right now, the term quality of life seems to resonate in the community. There's 3 schooling options. There's the town school, which is the public school. There's a Christian school here. And then there's a large group of homeschoolers. So that whole dynamic is a part of the history of Three Hills. What I did was I interviewed a friend of mine whose name is Rod, and he came to town in 1965. No, he came to town in 1981. But Rod and his family moved here from Calgary because things were happening in the 60s and 70s in Calgary that he didn't like. So Rod moved to Calgary, to Three Hills in 1981. His parents moved here in 1965. So both his family and the family of his wife lived here. And the reason I interviewed Rod is because I don't know if he's a believer or not, but he's a good friend of mine. He's a real estate agent. He's been around forever, and he's well respected in the community. And he was chairman of the hospital board when they put up the new hospital. And so I talked to him and I said, why did you come here? And he came from Calgary, and he left a promising career, but he gave it up because of his core values, he said. So this change of occupation brought him to Three Hills, and having family here also helped in the decision to move. But he moved here as a result of his core values. And he talked at length about the quality of life and family life in a small town atmosphere. He said it takes a community to raise a kid, and his core values were similar to the values of the town. He gave up a promising career based on his core values. He wanted a small town rural agricultural dynamic for his kids. He knew he left some things in Calgary, like access to education, like university and higher coaching levels of gymnastics and things like that. But he said, no, I wanted to come out here because of what was happening. Sports facilities, ball diamonds, curling, all the amenities are here in this community, including support for seniors, government, health, all those kind of things. So, and then he's lived through the crash of 2008, 2012, the flood of April 2018. He's lived through the drought of 2002, and now he's living through COVID. So those are some of the things that Rod has lived through and he's experienced, but he really loved the safety aspect of a smaller town. And so that's a little bit of Rod's business. So he was a school teacher here, and then he retired from school teaching. Then he bought a local business in the 1990s, and then he sold that and retired. But then when the 2008 crash hit, then he came back and began to work as a real estate agent. So that's a little bit of Rod's story, a guy in the community, and that's where, so that's a little bit of history from Three Hills and a little bit of history of one of its solid, respectable members.
Yeah, you can totally tell that in his story. You can see that he moved there, again, just like you articulated really well, for what Three Hills has to offer. He had exposure to it because of his parents and his in-laws having lived there. And then I think it's interesting that he's been able to pivot so many times. Think about the quality of the soil of Three Hills in a metaphorical way. From I left behind the job that I had, I became a school teacher, I became a business owner, I moved into real estate. And even though these traumas have happened here, we can weather the storm and get through. You know, I kept thinking about how t-shirts would be made out of that. You know, this happened in my area. You know, I lived through the freeze of 1989. There was a freeze that devastated the citrus industry. And, you know, there's a sense of camaraderie and grit that's developed during that time frame. Yeah, I think it's interesting too, to be able to, you know, I know that you talked about, you know, Rod, you're interested in him and he's a city leader too. I wonder what his story is with Jesus. I'd be curious, because though you didn't quite emphasize it the same way that Brian did, you can still see Prairie Bible College and kind of this rootedness of a religious people group. But he's coming here in this later time frame, and that's an undergirding principle that has kept what he has really come to like. But I'm curious about his story. Maybe that's an area for some calibration of invitation and challenge at an appropriate time. So
one of the things, though, that's interesting is that when L.E. Maxwell came in 1922 to start the school, he actually had this idea. He's raising soldiers for the kingdom. Like, men were separated from women. Well, Claren went to that Bible college. You know, there was pink and blue sidewalks, you know. Well, there wasn't, but I mean,
wow.
There was a strong separation of, you're here to study and become a missionary for the kingdom of God, and none of this other stuff. So there, I mean, there was, but I mean, there was this idea that L.E. Maxwell wanted to raise up warriors and workers in the kingdom of God. What happened, I'm not sure it was L.E., but there was a legalistic spirit that kind of came out of Prairie Bible College, but it spilled over into the community. So then there became this chasm, growing chasm between Prairie on the north side of Highway 583 and the town school on the south side of Highway 583. So when Debbie and I moved here in 1994, we came into a culture we didn't understand, because we had to learn about terms like Peebs and Townies. Wow. And then the fights that went on between the Peebs and the Townies. And when the two hockey teams played together, it was against each other. It was war. Wow. And so there was an unappreciative spirit from the Townies to the Peebs because of this religious spirit. Like, people would shop in the schools or the stores in Three Hills, and they would find tracts hidden beneath the stack of jeans, because that was the way that some of the students from Prairie were going to witness. They were going to slide tracts in between, you know, so people would find these tracts and come to know Jesus because they were shopping for a pair of pants. Well, some of this religious spirit was just a real rub. And so it was pretty intense when we moved here. My kids went to town school and they were Christians, but the Peebs couldn't figure them out. Why are you, a preacher's kid, going to town school when there's a good, solid Christian school here? And of course, that kind of rubbed against my wife and I's core values we believed in the public school system and hanging out with non-Christians. And so I had tension in the church I was pastoring between the town people and the Prairie people, even in the church a little bit. So that's a little bit of the dynamic that was there. But this guy, Rod, that I brought you through, he actually kind of lived above that a little bit. I think he kind of saw both sides for what they were and lived a little bit above it. But now there's not so much of this animosity, but boy, when you drew a line down through the middle of Three Hills, 583, you knew exactly which side of the town you were living on.
Wow.
Amazing. So that's an interesting piece of history of it too.
Yep. Great stuff.
Claren could probably feel it. He lived here for 3 years.
Claren, why did you put those tracks in the jeans and hurt?
Because that's what they told us to do in evangelism class. I did street evangelism in Calgary and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, Prairie was 700 students in the Bible college, 300 in the high school. So it's 1,000 people plus the faculty and staff that ran the campus. So how much percentage of the town would that have been, Lynn?
Oh, a third, 1/3.
1/3 would have been tied in with the school.
Yeah.
So it's a significant amount of the population. That's why it was so divisive.
Wow.
And it definitely was legal. It got legalistic. I'm not sure if that was really L.E. Maxwell's intent. It was just very devoted to Jesus, which got into law keeping in some ways. So
Yeah.
yeah. Anyways,
we see happen again and again, especially as it leaves the kind of the founder's hands. Sometimes you get aberrations of maybe the original intent, and we know that that type of thing tends to happen. Legalism can be birthed out of those things, which doesn't take away from its original heart intent. It's got good intention in there. It's just the practice that can come across in it can be detrimental, and in some ways needs to be repented of. So yeah, I think that's interesting. And if we had more time, I'm looking at the clock right now, I'd probably want to spend some time thinking about, tell me how that's not so much prevalent any longer. How have the Peebs and the Townies dealt with that? Has it been swept under the rug? Is it just that we're in a new generation? And then, what healing might need to happen in there? And then what's the new division that might be forming that could be addressed? So there's a lot of different areas I could see going in here and digging out at the same time frame. And then I think because we're looking at Rod's story versus when we were looking at Brian's, we were looking at Brian's family story. I'm thinking about, Lynn, your relationship to Rod and all the things that God's doing in you to potentially encourage him in a variety of different ways. So how about any other one or two closing thoughts as we wrap this up?
It was interesting that as followers of Jesus, we kind of had to defend ourselves against Christian legalism with our friends in the town.
Yeah.
It was just a weird dance that we were trying to do. No, we're followers of Jesus, but we're not legalistic. And we send our kids to town school. So people were just kind of scratching their heads at us. We're kind of bridging both worlds, but
makes total sense.
It was.
Yeah, Prairie didn't really understand how to live missionally. They were separatists.
Yep.
Very much.
Right? So they didn't really integrate into the community. Like you evangelize them, you didn't really build relationship with them. Mm-hmm. But this has changed though, Lynn, right? Like,
oh yeah,
for I don't know, 20 years or more now, it's kind of made, well, Prairie changed its attitude.
Yeah. So when Prairie began to shift and change and move out of that legalistic spirit, then the town became less defensive and took more of at least a posture of, well, who are you now? What are you changing into? And then there was an attempt to move Prairie out of town about 10 years ago. And then the town leaders kind of got up in arms because they didn't want Prairie to leave. Because they experienced the financial benefits of all the people in town, but they didn't want their religion, but they wanted their economy. And so it was a weird kind of thing going on. So yeah.
That's great.
Anyways, yeah, so things are changing a bit, but actually it was the Christian posture of relaxing that began to actually win the day.
That's good. And probably will need to be emphasized moving forward still. So I'm curious too, who was it that led Prairie in that change? That's a pretty radical change agent to be able to make that shift, especially in a legalistic, culture. That's a hard thing to get a legalistic culture to change its ways, because it continually reinforces its, especially with separatist tendencies. It's almost like the things that it does already reinforce its own preconceived ideas. So,
well, that's interesting, because in part it was the great grandson of L.E. Maxwell that led the way. He's now, Mark Maxwell is the president of Prairie.
There you go.
He has the grandson.
Yep.
Grandson.
The grandson of the founder has led the way. Basically, they started to transition, but Mark is leading the way from. Yeah, and I think maybe Mark probably expresses the spirit of his grandfather well.
Yeah.
But Mark is for a new generation. So that's interesting that the leader of the revolution is the grandson of the founder.
Yep. There you go. And again,
he'd have chips, like he'd have enough.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Street
to make
cred,
the change.
Yep. Like he can speak about, like, I know what my grandfather lived for, and I can reassure you, I care about that too. But, and he had to have a lot of buts. This is what we've got to do. And those would be amazing, scripts to study. How did he do that? So, all right, friends.
It's interesting that now the Mark Maxwell is a member of the Evangelical Missionary Church, and we're not even connected to Prairie, so he's attending our church.
Oh, is he really?
Yeah, he started when he moved here. He started attending the Bethel EMC, the old church I was pastoring, and he's now a member.
Wow!
Not the Prairie Tab, not the Congregational Church.
Woo!
That's good.
No wonder. Get some good DNA influence on them.
That's good. All right, friends. I'll put together a follow-up email, point the direction for where we're headed next, but it feels like we hit some good ground and seeing the way that understanding our history and our biography can give us some insight in how to be able to communicate for change. So, all right. Bless you guys. Have a great day.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael.